That's all right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Servine, you were questioned about one of the factors under the Endangered Species Act, and that factor being whether a recovery plan has an adequate regulatory mechanism for a particular species. And I've been working on these issues for quite some time. I have never seen a recovery plan that does not include some kind of a backstop that would protect a recovered species, including constant monitoring, surveys, radio collaring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to ensure that if there is a particular species, whether it's the Canadian gray wolf or the grizzly bear or whatever it may be, once that management plan goes into effect, you're not trying to imply that there's absolutely no effort after that to determine what's going on with that species, are you?
No, I am not.
Okay, so typically with these recovery plans and in recovery plans that are at issue in this hearing right now, they actually have those kinds of mechanisms in place, don't they? Where there is constant monitoring of the number of grizzly bears or the gray wolf population to ensure that those populations stay above the recovery threshold, don't they?
Well, the monitoring in and of itself does not assure that the animals stay above
No,
their
but they have
threshold.
those in place, and then there are tripwires that go into effect. So, for example, in Wyoming, with the Canadian gray wolf, if the population goes down below a certain level, even if it's during the trophy game hunting season, there's an immediate stop to any further hunting. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so those are the kinds of things that are in place with these recovery plans to ensure that the numbers don't go below what is required or what is agreed to in terms of the delisting. Is that right?
That is in effect the case, but that is not what my concern is.
No, but that's when you were questioned by Mr. Huffman about that being one of the factors, whether there was an adequate regulatory mechanism. Part of the adequate regulatory mechanism is ensuring that those, whatever the species may be, doesn't decline below the recovered population, correct? Isn't that the purpose of it?
That is correct. You have
Yes.
to know how many animals die in order to know that.
And you're also aware, but when we're talking about the numbers under the Endangered Species Act, we're concerned about the number of live animals, right? So in Wyoming, I'll use that as an example again, for the Canadian gray wolf that was introduced, a non-native species that was introduced into Wyoming in 1995, the original recovery goal was 100 animals for Wyoming, for Idaho, and Montana. Were you aware of that? That was the original recovery goals.
Yes, I was aware of that.
Yes, and so eventually, when we started working on the recovery plans, then we got buffers in place. And so then the recovery goal went to 150. Were you aware of that?
I am aware of that, yes.
Okay, so then we have buffers in addition, which is another part of the adequate regulatory mechanism to ensure that if your recovery goal is 100, we're not managing in Wyoming for 100 Canadian gray wolves, are we?
I don't believe so. My concern is not with Wyoming.
We're managing for much higher than that, aren't we? And the same with the grizzly bears. We will manage for a much higher population than the original 600 in terms of the recovery goal, right? Isn't that in the management plan?
That is in the management plan.
That's right.
My
So that's
concern is not with Wyoming.
So that would be considered an adequate regulatory mechanism, wouldn't it?
I'm not sure that I can answer your question.
Okay, so for the Greater Yellowstone area, as long as we're managing above the recovery goals and our recovery plan requires that, that is exactly what the Endangered Species Act means by an adequate regulatory mechanism, isn't it?
You have to know how many animals die in order to manage for your
not
target.
necessarily, because you have to know how many are alive. We're managing for live animals, aren't we? Isn't the recovery goal 600 or 700 or 1,000? We're not managing for less than 500 dead. When you do a recovery plan, does it state in there can be no more than 500 dead animals? That isn't what the Endangered Species Act says, is it?
Sustainable mortality requires you know how many animals die as well as how many animals are out there.
But the recovery plan and whether we're meeting the requirements of the Endangered Species Act relates to live animals, correct?
No, it also relates to the number of mortalities.
That's what the biological opinion says. They give us the numbers of how many animals we need to have, how many Canadian gray wolves we need to have in Wyoming. Did you know in Wyoming, with a recovery goal of 100 wolves, we have over 350 Canadian gray wolves in Wyoming?
I understand that's the case. I'm not
And
a
in
wolf
Idaho,
expert, though.
and in Idaho and Montana, they have over 1,000 Canadian gray wolves in each of those states. Were you aware of that?
They do at present, I understand.
Yes,
right?
thank you.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair recognizes Mr. Byer for